Counsel?
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution would like the defense to focus only on Janet Arvizo. That is their dream. Their dream is that we will focus on her and somehow the children will look clean and honest and truthful. And I want to make sure that's not what our thrust is. You may recall that Gavin Arvizo met Chris Tucker at his home and lied. He told him, "We made no money at the fundraiser," and that's when Chris Tucker wrote a check. Chris Tucker described him as cunning, smart. He didn't trust him. Even at a young age, Star Arvizo told Louise Palanker, "All we got was love for Christmas," and she began to write the $10,000 checks. Develine kept hassling Asha Pryor for Chris Tucker's truck. It was relentless. She finally had to stop talking to Develine, and she actually liked Develine. I don't want to suggest, in any shape or form, this is just a target of Janet. The whole family has difficulties with the truth, difficulties with honesty, difficulties with money, and the children have been raised this way. Now, I want to make a couple of things clear that I talked about earlier. In the J.C. Penney fraud, which Gavin was very much a part of at a young age, Janet was arrested and got out of jail at 9:15. David got out of jail at 12:03. Janet checked into the ER at 1:11 that day claiming she'd be injured. The family has been part of these fraud scams, not someone alone. When David was in the picture and manipulating celebrities, he used Gavin. Do you remember George Lopez said, "We'd go to a mall, and David would be standing there, and Gavin would be asking me to buy all these things. And I thought it was strange that the father would simply stand there, not say anything, and let his child just keep asking me to buy and buy and buy. But that's the way it's worked." Mrs. Watson Johnson said that Star would call her asking for money and she could hear Janet in the background coaching him. Mary Holzer said that Janet bragged to her that her kids were good actors, that Gavin knew his lines well, but Star used to falter. He wasn't quite as smart, wasn't quite up to it. Could you believe how many witnesses came in to establish this mo of scamming and manipulating and lying? Can you believe that many people would come in to testify that this family has gotten in a rhythm, a pattern of going after celebrities? Because it's worked and worked and worked. It's a family program. It's not just Janet's problems. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has tried to focus your attention on what they now call pornography at Neverland. And they found for the last 10 years worth of Hustler, Playboy, Penthouse, things of that sort. All legal, all heterosexual. In a library of thousands and thousands of books, they found a couple of books that focused on men. And they wanted you to think that somehow Mr. Jackson was some. I don't know whether they're trying to say he's a gay man, or, as Mr. Zonin in his mean questioning, try to suggest he's asexual. They're not sure which way they're going. But basically they went through this home where thousands and thousands of books have accumulated, where the evidence was, that when fans around the world sent things to Mr. Jackson, he keeps everything like a pack rat. And what did they find? They found this book, Boys Will Be Boys, OK. Published in New York in 1966. Yes, it has some naked pictures of boys. It also has pictures that are not naked, OK? And what does it say? What is inscribed in the book? It says, "Look at the true spirit of happiness and joy in these boys' faces. This is the spirit of boyhood, a life I never had and will always dream of. This is the life I want for my children, MJ." Now, you've already seen the outtakes where Mr. Jackson talks about his not having a childhood. He was working clubs at a young age at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Your Honor, I'll object to this matter as exceeding the scope of the court ruling.
Your Honor, the prosecution talked similarly about Bashir.
It's the outtakes.
The objection is sustained on that.
Is this the sign of a pedophile? To write an inscription in a published book of this sort? The other book, The Boy, a photographic essay, says, "To Michael, from your fan, Rhonda, with a little heart. 1983, Chicago," it says in it. Now, Mr. Zonin didn't know what to do with that, so he suggested through his questioning on cross-examination that maybe somebody had faked it. But there's no evidence anybody faked that. They seized these things in the early 90s. And was there any evidence that these books were ever shown to any witness? No. Not one witness came into this courtroom and said, "Michael Jackson showed me books of men." Not one. Now, we're asking you to use your common sense in this area of alleged pedophilia. First of all, they never put a pedophilia expert on the stand, because they were afraid. Having all of these heterosexual books and magazines doesn't add up to pedophilia, okay? What do you typically find? You find illegal child pornography, websites galore, pictures. None of that came in. And, yes, the prosecution suggested they would prove that, and none of it was found at Neverland. No websites of pedophilia. No child sex pictures on websites. No photographs. None of the things you typically associate with a pedophile. And their biggest problem is repeated editions of Hustler, and Playboy, and Penthouse, and Barely Legal, do not equate with what they're trying to prove. I'm not saying it's necessarily commendable that you have all these magazines, but you can get them at any newsstand and there's been no evidence that anything was illegal. And if Mr. Jackson has been proven to like to read these magazines for years and years and years, how does that equate to their theory that he wanted to sexually touch a male child? It doesn't. There's a problem with their case. And as I said before, not one of these books they found, among thousands, of males was shown to a single witness. No illegal child pornography, either in a website or anywhere else. No websites where you try to meet children, like pedophiles often do, and the rest. This is nothing but a mean-spirited attempt to damage his reputation and embarrass him by digging into his private life through repeated searches, with 70 officers, trying to find something to dirty him up with. They have dirtied him up, because he's human. But they haven't proved their case. They can't. Now, you know that Gavin and Starr tried to act like they're very naive on sexual matters. Do you remember that last police interview which they showed you so you would understand Gavin's demeanor? Well, you can certainly study his demeanor in conjunction with what's said, because they played for you what was said. It wasn't offered for the truth. The tape was offered to show his demeanor, but you can consider his demeanor in terms of what is said. Do you remember, after Mr. Roble said, "We're going to bring a criminal case against Mr. Jackson, and you're the victims, you and your mom," before they'd even investigated? Do you remember he started off by looking at Gavin and saying, "Tell me something that's wrong. Give me an example of something that's wrong." And Gavin hesitated, and you study his demeanor. He's sort of stymied. He doesn't quite know what to say. He comes up with, "Staying out late at night."
All object to the content as exceeding the scope of the court ruling.
Overruled.
And then they ask him, "Come up with something else." And he hesitates. He has this guilty look on his face. He doesn't know what to say. He says, "Break things." And then Mr. Roble says, "How about something else?" He hesitates. He looks stymied. He looks confused, and he says, "Kill somebody." Did he ever say lie, cheat, or steal? Do most children his age, if you ask them, "Give me an example of something that's wrong," say, "Don't lie. Don't tell the truth"? No. And if you have time in the jury room, just take a look at the beginning of that interview. By the way, that's the same interview where his mother's outside the door, and he says, "I haven't told my mother any of this," after they met for months with lawyers, okay? That's the same interview where you can study his demeanor as he lies about wanting to leave Neverland because he was scared. Didn't he testify to you that he loved Neverland, wanted to be there? Didn't he tell various witnesses he loved Neverland, wanted to be there? Study his demeanor. That's why they ask you to look at it. Study it, and study this sort of fake notion that he's unsophisticated in sexual matters. He acts like he doesn't know what an erection is. He's 13. His brother's been caught with girly magazines at Neverland. He acts like he doesn't know what an ejaculation is. He acts so innocent. They've been meeting with Feldman and Dickerman and Masada and Katz for months. He's been talking to his mother about this stuff for months. Do you believe for a second they went to Feldman without thinking there was some type of molestation they could pull off? Why else do you go to Feldman? Why else? Do you really believe his mother was outside the door and they never talked about it? Study his demeanor. You don't see much emotion. You know, one of the most important moments in this trial was, I submit that when you get in the jury room, discuss this occurrence. He's on the witness stand. He describes the alleged sexual touching, the alleged molestation. You saw no emotion whatsoever. When did you see him really get mad? When he talked about Michael Jackson abandoning his family. Do you remember? Do you remember the emotion, the anger? Do you remember how he reacted? You can't look at a transcript and see it. You have to see it in person. He was angry because he felt that Michael Jackson had abandoned his family. They were not part of his world. And he wanted to be part of his world. That was clear. No emotion about the alleged touching. Plenty of emotion about, why did Michael do that to us? That happened on cross-examination. And that sums up this case when it comes to Gavin Arvizo. Put all of this together. What do you get? The Arvizos, Gavin and Starr, tried to suggest that Michael Jackson corrupted them with these magazines. Yet Starr was caught twice with his own magazines. Julio Avila caught him with a magazine in his backpack. He said, "I got it at home," when he was caught writing, "suck dick," on the wall. That is not a naive kid on sexual matters, but they'd like you to think it was all Michael Jackson taking these innocent little lambs and corrupting their minds. And it's baloney. They tried to tell you that Michael Jackson taught them masturbation and taught them the facts of life, and, again, they were just these innocent little kids. But they were caught masturbating by Riho, who took the stand and was as honest as can be and thoroughly abused by Mr. Zonin. Do you remember he started to wipe his eyes? He was so scared about this whole event? Gavin and Starr are not what they're trying to make you think they are. I've already talked about the financial motive. It's clear as day. You don't keep going to all these lawyers and changing your claims unless you have a financial motive. Demeanor? Well, in that police interview that they ended their case with, do you remember Gavin begins with, "How long is this going to take?" Do you remember that? You've got a police officer stroking him along. You're the victim. You're the victim. We're going after Michael Jackson. We're going after his people. We're on your side. Don't be afraid, encouraging him to make these accusations that conflict with things that he said to the police on other occasions. He didn't show emotion. Remember, he's trained as an actor. His mother's proud of it. He's proud of it. Does it complicate your job? Yes. But you have to deal with the facts. Does it make it harder to believe him beyond a reasonable doubt? It does. But the facts are the facts are the facts. These are the same kids that were dancing on the stage at the Laugh Factory about their poverty so celebrities would feel sorry for them. Now, as I said before, we're going to get into some transcript, because transcripts don't lie. I want to show you what they said in this courtroom so the prosecution can't get up and just misinterpret what they said or did. Let me cover a few more points first. The alcohol counts. I want to be clear on what you're being asked to do. The felony alcohol counts require proof beyond a reasonable doubt that alcohol was given to molest Gavin Arvizo. He's the only alleged victim of those counts. What they're saying is Michael Jackson, with all you know about him through this trial, would look at a cancer patient, a child, and say, "Aha, I'm going to ply him with alcohol so I can disable him and molest him." Michael Jackson couldn't even conceive of such a thing. He couldn't. The same problems with the molestation counts exist for the felony alcohol counts, because it's allegedly giving alcohol for the purpose of molesting. Now, Judge Melville read you the jury instructions yesterday, and there is the option of a misdemeanor count on alcohol. It's called a lesser included. But it still requires that you believe Gavin Arvizo beyond a reasonable doubt, okay? And it still requires that the time period for the alleged molestation be the time period for that misdemeanor count. And you can't believe Gavin Arvizo on alcohol beyond a reasonable doubt. Why? He and Starr claim they only drank with Michael Jackson. Remember that? They repeatedly say that under oath. Shane Meredith caught the two of them in the wine cellar with a half-empty bottle of wine. Michael Jackson was nowhere around. So they lied under oath. Riho Jackson. He says he was in Michael Jackson's bedroom. Michael Jackson was in the bathroom. A glass and a bottle of alcohol was brought in while Michael Jackson was in the bathroom. Gavin and Starr ran upstairs and then ran out of the room, and after they'd run out of the room, alcohol was missing from the bottle. Now, I ask you this. If Michael was so freely giving them alcohol, why did they have to run out of the room behind his back? Why? Simone Jackson was in the kitchen area, saw them come in and go to the refrigerator and take alcohol. They didn't see her. Michael Jackson was nowhere near where they were that night. They've lied under oath about alcohol. Angel Vivanco. He says that Starr told him, "You either put this liqueur in my milkshake or I'll get you fired." Michael Jackson isn't there. Now, the alcohol allegations don't relate to the air flight, okay? That's not the time period. As I said before, the time period for the alcohol allegations is the same time period for the molestation allegations, which allegedly start February 20th. And I've talked to you about how weird that is and how ridiculous it is. But the Arvizos came up with this story on the plane about drinking alcohol, but Cynthia Bell saw none of this. And she didn't have credibility problems. They did. Michael Jackson wanted alcohol in cans so kids couldn't see it, because he does drink alcohol on occasion and he doesn't like to advertise it. Of course, with this investigation, his personal life has been turned topsy-turvy, and they're trying to make a criminal out of him because he gets intoxicated from time to time. You have to look at this with a human lens. You have to look at him as a human being. He's been put under this microscope his whole life as this megastar. Some say he's better known than Elvis around the world, but that has a price attached to it. And the price sometimes is loneliness and confusion and not knowing who your friends even are. And he is a human being, but he's not a criminal. Jesus solace. They thought he was going to be their star witness on alcohol. They put him on the stand. He said he came into Michael's room with wine, glasses and soda. They got upset that he mentioned soda. He said, "You never asked me about it before." Now, if Michael Jackson is giving alcohol to the Arvizos, then why is he coming into his room with soda cans for them? Why? When the Arvizos testified that they only had alcohol with Michael Jackson, they lied, and they lied and they lied. You cannot believe them beyond a reasonable doubt. You cannot convict on those counts. I just want to refer you to the end of this. Some of this is a little repetitive, but he's not charged with negligent or lax supervision. That's not a crime. It's not in this case. If they were running wild around Neverland because their parents let them do it or Michael let them do it, if they get a hold of the key, if they did kitchen raids, as they testified to, in the house and grabbed alcohol from the refrigerator, that's not a crime he's charged with. He's not charged with being negligent, okay? They've got to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he intended to furnish stuff to these kids. I want to refer you to the third one, because, in their efforts to say there's a conspiracy by Michael Jackson to abduct children, extort, falsely imprison, that because he was having a cash flow problem, despite the millions he makes every year, that he was going to engage in this scam to whisk this family off to Brazil, I'd like to refer you to the third item. Ladies and gentlemen, turn on the television any night of the week. Don't celebrities have public relations problems? Don't celebrities get arrested, get charged, get videotaped in compromising positions, get audiotaped, get photographed? Don't people who've known them with an axe to grind come forward and tell stories? When they have public relations problems, they deal with them. The public relations problems associated with Bashir were dealt with. You had a Maury Povich documentary to deal with it. It was a successful documentary. All of these various factors came together to produce it on the 20th. This is the way celebrities deal with PR problems. They're always faced with them, and their public relations spokespeople always tell them, this is a crisis. This is the biggest problem of your life. We'll deal with it. Here's how we deal with it. The idea that the Bashir documentary was such a public relations problem that he would commit felonies like this is ridiculous. Now, if some of the people around them are excessive, I don't know if they were or not. I mean, they brought in evidence there was a rock thrown at the Arvizo house. I mean, Michael Jackson is nowhere near that if it happened. They brought in testimony that the Germans, so to speak, were mean to Janet, although Angel Vivanco says she was having champagne with Dieter, and they appeared to be getting along the first time and the next time they weren't. If anybody acted excessively, Michael Jackson didn't. He's nowhere to be seen. And he had no intention and would never deal with a PR crisis. It wasn't the first PR crisis in his career, by the way. He's been under a microscope, a looking glass, since he was a child. He doesn't engage in a conspiracy to kidnap a family to Brazil. The response was the documentary, which was successful. Okay, alright, and I will show you Janet's transcripts, that she knew a lot of police officers. Do you remember I asked her all these questions about Andrew Lassick, a police officer that she knew, police officers from the MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, that she knew, and she was gladly describing how the police station was constructed. I'll show you the transcript. And Lassick was in touch with them. She had his cell phone number. She knew other police in the area and never went to any of them and said, "We're in trouble. We're being falsely imprisoned. We're being held against our will. We're victims." Nothing of this. She told Asha Pryor she was hoping to go to Brazil and she hoped Asha would come with her. Now, you know that David Legrand was concerned that Dieter and Konitzer and Schaffel, he even investigated Vinny and Frank, who were like really young kids. He was concerned they were all engaged in self-dealing and they were taking advantage of Michael Jackson. And he hired an investigative firm in New York to investigate. Do you remember the testimony about finding an offshore account that he thought Sony had set up, etc.? And he approached Dieter and Konitzer and said, "Where did this $900,000 go? You've just withdrawn it. Justify it." And of course Mr. Auchincloss, in a remarkable shift of position, got up and tried to prove they hadn't stolen anything. If Legrand was concerned about these alleged co-conspirators and what they were doing to Michael, does that suggest Michael is involved in a conspiracy with them? Or does it suggest the same old pattern of Michael Jackson, the creative genius, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in his lifetime, and letting people sign his name, and letting people steal money, and letting people get away with all sorts of financial things? Otherwise, with what you've seen of his finances, why would he have cash flow problems? Why would that Beatles catalog be leveraged? He hasn't always managed money well, but he's not a criminal, and he doesn't commit crimes because of it. You know that Wisner and Konitzer tried to take over his business, because Legrand said so. He saw documents where they said, "We're going to take over Michael Jackson's affairs." You know that Schaffel was stealing from Michael Jackson. Their star witness, Rudy Provencio, who none of you would buy a used car from, believe me, he said Schaffel was stealing from Michael Jackson. Remember Provencio, who suddenly came up with a diary at the last minute, who was recording people's phone calls not knowing he was being recorded as well, and in one classic comment said, "I'm not even giving my lawyer information. This is for the book, honey." Remember the word, honey. This is the guy they want you to think you can trust, their star witness on conspiracy, who couldn't put Michael Jackson anywhere either, except in a recording studio. They did nothing to refute the notion that Garrigus, as any lawyer would in his position, put the Arvizos under surveillance. You're allowed to do that. It's done in cases all the time. People do in divorce cases. They do it in criminal cases, and they have private investigators who are licensed, like Miller was, follow people around to see where they're going. And based on what you knew of the Arvizos, you can see why. It's not part of a conspiracy. It was a lawyer representing a celebrity client who he feared was about to be shaken down, about to be taken advantage of, who had a history of being taken advantage of, and he did exactly what he should have done. He investigated, and he was very open about what he did. As I said before, if this was a conspiracy to hide a family, or worse, whatever they're saying, why is Miller using a bonded, licensed mover, who had pretty good record-keeping procedures, to move their stuff into storage and put it under his name? Dickerman and Janet and Masada meet at the Laugh Factory on the 21st. Dickerman never calls the police. And as I said before, after the 21st, she continues to go to these various embassies and get her visas and her passport stuff done. Does that suggest there's a conspiracy going on? Does that suggest she's worried? Or does it suggest, hey, you know, we wanted Michael to be our family. We wanted to be included. There's nobody left now. Gavin's healed. Star's healed. We're not going to use illness to generate money anymore through any lies or manipulations. We're slipping away from Mr. Jackson. These guys are taking over his affairs. They're keeping us away from him. Now how do we get something out of this? Go to a lawyer. That's what she did, and that's what she's still doing. You've heard a lot about the body wax, the shopping sprees, the hair appointment. She had an excuse for everything. That somehow she was being forced to the orthodontist against her will. That somehow she was being forced to get a body wax against her will. The woman from the salon came in, and it was interesting. She said Janet looked at her and said, "I'm from South America." A little strange. Sounds like she might have Brazil on her mind, and it sounds like it may not be something she's particularly concerned about. But she was left there alone. She could have done whatever she wanted. She could have called 911 at any time. She wanted a hair appointment for the next day. I mean, all of these witnesses came in. No one detected any concern by Janet that she was being held against her will. Nobody saw a PR crew following. Nobody substantiated any of the things Janet said to you under oath, because they're false. Her problem, as I said before, was, she figured out, at some point Michael's not going to be our family, father soon. Now what do we do to gain? And here we are. Now, the prosecutor talked about these alleged prior bad acts. A prosecutor once told me, prior bad acts are a band-aid for a bad case, because none of these alleged victims are alleged victims in this case. So why do they bring them in? If they've got such a great case for Gavin being a victim, why are they bringing these people in, and why are they trying to sell you false claims of molestation? And I do mean false. Macaulay Culkin says he was never molested. He called it absolutely ridiculous. And they tried to attack Macaulay like he was trying to lie on the stand. They want you to believe people like Ralph Chacon, Adrian McManus and Qasim Abdul rather than Macaulay Culkin or Wade Robson or Brett Barnes. Why does a prosecution come into this courtroom and tell you these three people are victims of molestation when they are absolutely adamant they're not? Why? If they're trying to tell you the truth. Adrian McManus said in a deposition under oath that Mr. Jackson never did anything to any child. Then changes her story, goes to the tabloids. She and Chacon and Abdul find out that Blanca Francia and Jordan Chandler got money, and they want money, too. They don't want to work. They want to be millionaires at Mr. Jackson's expense. Ladies and gentlemen, when he settled those 2 cases in the early 90s, he became a real target for people who don't want to work. And he still is. McManus, a judge in this courthouse, in this county, finds that she stole from a child's trust. A judge in this courthouse finds that she acted with malice against Michael Jackson. She sues Michael Jackson. He cross-complains and decides not to settle that case, just to fight it. It's the longest trial in the history of, civil trial in the history of this courthouse, 6 months. And he prevails, and he wins his cross-complaint, and there's a judgment against McManus and Chacon and Kasem for over $1 million. McManus is found with materials from Neverland stored in her house. She steals from a children's trust. She steals from Mr. Jackson. She has judgments against her. They want you to believe her over these alleged victims who come in and say, he didn't do anything to us. What does that tell you about their case? What does that tell you about how desperate they are to do something to win? Wade Robson got on the stand and he said, "These claims that I was molested are ridiculous," were his words. What does Mr. Zonin do? He starts grabbing these books and shoving them in his face, books he's never seen before, and asking him to describe sex acts to you. That's his response. Abusive, mean-spirited, and having nothing to do with seeking the truth. Nothing. Brett Barnes came in and was angry. He said, "It absolutely never happened. I wouldn't stand for it." He was angry. He flew from Australia, he gave up his job, to come here and testify that this stuff is false. Do they want you to believe him? No. No. Put your faith and trust in Ralph Chacon, who said he wanted to be a millionaire in his deposition in that case. Put your faith and trust in Kasem Abdul, who forgot that he had signed a statement saying he never saw anything improper happen at Neverland and admitted he wanted to be a millionaire. Put your faith and trust in Adrian McManus. Put your faith and trust in all the trips to the tabloids they made through that agent they hired, who they claim their lawyer was responsible for. Don't believe these 3 young men who say, "We were never touched." It's the story of this case. Jordan Chandler never testified. He filed a lawsuit with Larry Feldman and got money. Mr. Jackson settled that case in the early 90s. He didn't even come into court, say one way or the other. His mother hasn't seen him. June Chandler, his mother, never testified she saw any molestation. What she testified to was that Michael became essentially a member of their family and stayed at their home in his room. She also said he stayed at her ex-husband's home in the room with Jordan, but she never saw any molestation and never testified to any. And that's a strange story, too, because Joy Robson said, she's a gold digger. She made a statement in an interview that men had disappointed her in her life and she didn't know if she wanted another man in her life, meaning Michael. Joy was correct. She was out for fame and fortune, and that's what she's all about. Blanca Francia took $20,000 from a tabloid, talked to Larry Feldman and ended up with another lawyer and settled. Jason Francia says tickling went too far after he initially denied anything had happened. He said, "At the age of 16, money became important to me, and he settled." And guess what? No criminal case was ever filed against Michael Jackson for any of these alleged victims. Now, let me ask you this, ladies and gentlemen. If Jason Francia cooperated with Mr. Sneddon, and indeed he said Mr. Sneddon was there for the first meeting with his counselor, I wonder what Mr. Sneddon was trying to do? If he cooperated with the sheriffs, if he allowed himself to be interviewed, although in his last interview, he said, "Don't tape record it." Do you remember that? That was an interview having to do with this trial. He and his lawyer showed up at the sheriff's office and said they didn't want it tape recorded, all right? But let's assume, and it seems pretty clear, that he cooperated with law enforcement from day one. Remember the cross-examination on his interviews? He first denied anything happened. Then these police were leaning on him with curse words, etc., and he said, "Well, he tickled me, and then he started remembering it went too far, etc., said his genitals were touched." Let's assume all of that's true. He cooperates. He works with Mr. Sneddon. He works with the sheriffs. Why was a case not filed? Why? Because they didn't think they could win one with him. He took money. His mom took money. His mom went to a tabloid. He came into court and said, "Gee, I didn't even know my mom went to a tabloid." Mr. Zonin said that to you in his closing argument a little while ago, like you're supposed to believe it. He didn't tell you he didn't want his interview with the police tape recorded, did he? No criminal case for any of these people. Philip Lamarck. I've already talked Chacon, McManus, Abdul. They were all part of that group that did the same thing. Philip Lamarck, he was the chef that claims that Macaulay Culkin was being touched, when Macaulay Culkin says he wasn't being touched. Remember, he was the one who tried to up his price to $500,000 for a story and said, "I was just kidding around." He had that agent representing him. He kept upping the price, and eventually he found out the agent sold the story himself. You're going to trust him over Macaulay Culkin? They want you to. That's what they want. If you listen to them, Macaulay, Wade, Brett, all came here to lie under oath and say they weren't molested. Do you buy any of that? I want to mention one other thing about these families. The prosecution would like you to think that Michael Jackson, the manipulative monster, sort of befriends families and just uses them and discards them, and that he somehow has a pattern of doing this, and he did it to the Arvizos, those poor souls. These families have been friends of Michael Jackson, in one case almost 20 years. They consider Michael to be in their family. They love him as a family member. They trust him. They have stayed friends all these years, and if they wanted to develop false claims, like others, they could have. And they could have stood in line for millions, the Robsons, the Barneses, Macaulay. They didn't. And when their family member, their friend, was in trouble in this courtroom, they came here to testify, and they didn't have to. Macaulay Culkin is 24 years old. He is very wealthy and very successful. He's on top of the world. He's in his 20s. You're immortal in your 20s. He didn't have to come here and testify for his friend. He did it because he wanted to do the right thing. And the same with Brett Barnes flying from Australia. The same with Wade Robson. He's a successful choreographer now. They came here to stand up for their friend in a time of need and tell the truth. And they want you to believe Chacon, Abdul and McManus and Lamarck rather than these three individuals and their families, sisters, mothers, etc. What does it tell you about their motives? What does it tell you about their case? What does it tell you about what they're willing to do to try and win in this courtroom? I have some timelines I just want to quickly go through with you before we get into transcript, if I may. J.C. Penney suit. Alright, August 27, 98, the arrest. Then you have the lawsuit filed in 99, okay? Janet files for divorce in October of 2001, right before the settlement. The settlement checks are received, and 10 days later she wants emergency welfare assistance. And as I said to you before, this provides a lens through which you can look at this case, because the sexual assault claims evolved later on. That's why her lawyer was so shocked at the deposition. Janet Arvizo versus David Arvizo. September 29, 01, she tells the Los Angeles Police Department her husband assaulted her. Later on, as things evolve, she claims false imprisonment and child molestation on Devaline, where Devaline says she doesn't remember it. Her mother told her about it. Now, I'm not saying David is some prize character. Apparently he's not. Sounds bad news to me and probably to you. But did he really molest Devaline? Or did Janet concoct it? And would Janet concoct false claims of sexual touching? Ask yourselves that question. Here's the lawsuit developing against Michael Jackson. February 21, she meets with attorney Bill Dickerman at the Laugh Factory. They have a number of meetings with Masada. She meets attorney Larry Feldman April 3. He has her meet with Stan Katz, his business associate, on May 15. Feldman goes to the police in June. Gavin's first interview is July. And all the while she's having meetings with Masada, Dickerman, Feldman and Katz, and the claims get bigger and bigger and bigger. Remember the correspondence that Dickerman sent Garrigus? Nothing about false imprisonment, nothing about alcohol, nothing about molestation. Begins with, make sure nobody has the rights to our film footage. Give us our stored materials back. Stop harassing us. Evolves, evolves, evolves. And you got to ask yourself this question. Gavin says he never told his mother, and he went to the police and finally said, I was molested, in July. Why did they go to Feldman in April? Why does anybody go to Feldman in a situation like this? Do any of you really think they didn't have in mind a molestation case when they went to Feldman? And you know something? 3 lawyers in this courtroom, Feldman, Dickerman and a lawyer for Blanca Francia, all told you Gavin, Starr, Devaline, they have till the age of 18 before the clock starts ticking on a civil suit. Feldman told you there's still time for Janet to sue Michael Jackson. And he told you he filed a notice of claim against Los Angeles County, and there's still time for Starr and Gavin to file a claim against Los Angeles County. And Janet on the stand tried to hesitate about whether he still represents her. They were playing all these games. But the fact is, he'd been on the phone with her recently, He'd been on the phone with J. Jackson, he had been helping her with subpoenas. What do you think is going on? If the time hasn't run to file a civil case, and if a conviction here allows you to automatically win it, and the lawyer's still in touch with these alleged victims, what do you think is going on? And by the way, remember in the J.C. Penney case, in her deposition Janet said, "Initially I only wanted an apology, and I said there would be no civil suit." Do you remember that? Did she keep her word? Did she file a civil suit eventually when she realized, I can get some money out of this deal? Did sexual assault claims then evolve later on? Yes. Same pattern, same motives, same lies. Just like here. Just like here. She just needs one more thing. You to convict Michael. All this group wants. Masada, Dickerman, Feldman, Katz and the Arvizos. That's all they need. And you have that power in your hands to make them rich, and they'll never have to work a day in their life. You have the power. I talked about the questionable timing of this so-called molestation. February 6th, airing of the Bashir documentary. There's a suspected child abuse report filed with DCFS February 10th. You have the rebuttal taping and the DCFS interview on the 19th and 20th. You got all these things going on. Look when they say the alleged molestation takes place. Does it make sense to any of you? How can it? Their problem was what they did on the 19th and 20th. Ladies and gentlemen, remember when Janet was asked questions about the Brad Miller interview on the 16th of February where she praised Michael Jackson as a father figure, someone who came into their life, mentored her children, kind, considerate, and she said it was all true. I'll show you the transcript. She said it was all true. But then she got there on the 20th and said it was all scripted, and she said essentially the same things. They had to allege molestation after the 20th because of all the statements they'd been making before that date. It's purely a manipulative gesture. And you're going to see through it, I believe. At this point I'd like to go into some of the trial testimony of Gavin Arvizo, because I think you'll find it quite revealing, especially in light of what Mr. Zonin said to you today. Did you ever go down there and drink any alcohol without Mr. Jackson being present? No. Under oath. And did you have? Don't tell us what she said, just tell us. I want to know. Did you have any conversations with her? Yes. Did you have any conversation with her about leaving? Yes. Did you want to leave, you personally? Not really, because I was kinda having fun. This is about leaving Neverland. Remember the police interview they showed you at the end of their case? I was scared. I wanted to leave. He's asked about the Bashir documentary where, as you know, he said nothing bad happens in Mr. Jackson's bed. Remember that? Well, as I said before, when all the furor starts and all the pressures from every side begin and the storm starts building is when they now claim molestation happens. He's asked about Mr. Jackson. Did Mr. Jackson ever say anything to you about going to Brazil? Yeah. What did he say? He said that we were going to go to Brazil, that we were going to have a good time. Do you remember anything else Mr. Jackson said to you about the trip? That he was going to come a week later after we got there. Now, assuming that's true and assuming they are planning a trip to Brazil, all of them, why can't you cancel it? And wasn't it cancelled? The tickets weren't purchased. The trip was cancelled. Nobody went out of the country. The Arvizos went home. Where's the crime? Please tell me. Where's the crime? Is it a crime to plan a trip abroad and cancel it? If you listen to the prosecution, it was a crime when Mr. Jackson thought of having a press conference in Florida and then cancelled it. Big nefarious part of a conspiracy. Nonsense. We would only drink with Michael. So, all right. So when you came back from Calabasas and Mr. Jackson was there, did you drink with him? Yes. He keeps saying they only drank with Michael, but the witnesses have proven that's a lie. A lie under oath. Repeatedly he says it. Why? Because it's to their advantage to say it. And you're supposed to believe him beyond a reasonable doubt on alcohol. He's the only alleged victim with alcohol. This is Mr. Snedden's questions. And where were you when you saw Mr. Jackson coming up the stairs? Do you remember the testimony of Starr and Gavin about Mr. Jackson coming up the stairs of his room naked? I'd like you to look carefully what happens here. Mr. Snedden. And where were you when you saw Mr. Jackson coming up the stairs? Me and my brother were laying on the bed. Q. And what were you doing? I think we were just laying there. Q. All right. And Mr. Jackson came up the stairs. Did you notice anything? Yeah, he was naked. Q. When you say, naked, what do you mean by that? A. Like not clothes on. Q. Did Mr. Jackson do or say anything at that point in time? No, He just ran up and just got something and went back down. Q. By Mr. Snedden. I'm sorry? A. I think he just ran up there and got something and went back downstairs. Q. Do you recall him saying anything at that point? A. No. Q. And what was your reaction to what you saw? A. Nothing. It was just kind of like. Me and my brother were kind of like. You know what I mean. Q. Kind of like what? Like we never really saw a grown man, like, naked before. Which, of course, is baloney, but. Here we go again. At some point. Now, they're trying to make that look like some kind of a molester or something. That Mr. Jackson was in his room, came out of the bathroom, came up the stairs, saw them, and ran back down again. Nothing nefarious happened at all. Q. At some point did you tell somebody else that you'd been drinking alcohol in connection with the fact that you had to collect your pee in that bottle? Yes. Now, keep going. Who was that? It was my mom. I want to present something to you. He admits at 4 o'clock in the morning telling his mother that he had wine. His mother admits on the stand that happened, that she knew he had wine. They have an appointment at Kaiser Hospital that morning. Janet takes possession of the urine sample. Vinny's driving. Now, does Gavin want that test if he's been drinking wine? Does Janet want that test if she knows he's been drinking wine? Do they really want to go to Kaiser and have him fail that test? What she came in here and said to you was, I noticed suddenly urine was missing and we never had the test. Do you believe her? Do you believe Gavin? Should you believe them? Is it possible the two of them didn't want to have the test? They wanted to make their appointment, because this was their treating physician. Do you necessarily believe Vinny had something to do with this? Think about their lack of credibility, their lies under oath, their manipulative scams and schemes. Are you sure they're victims when it comes to this urine sample and lack of test? What do you think? Let me go back. What did you say to your mother? Well, I called her and I told her, well, Mom, you know how Jesus drank juice. I mean, Jesus drank wine? And then she told me, I don't know. I don't remember what exactly she said. She said like, yeah. And then, like, I just tried to tell her that. I'm not really too sure what happened in that conversation. I know I called my mom and I told her. Their assumption is you must believe everything Janet said about suddenly finding urine missing, that they're victims. Why should you believe it? I know this. Michael Jackson's nowhere near any of this. I actually thought this was going to appear a little earlier, but we're back on that subject of Mr. Jackson going up naked, seeing them and running down the stairs. This is Mr. Snedden. And the time you said he was naked, yes. And I asked you whether or not he said anything to you at that particular point in time. And you said you didn't recall anything? I do not. Do you recall testifying at the grand jury? Yes. You testified there a couple of times, did you not? Yes. One time that I asked you questions and one time Mr. Zonin did? Yes. Would it refresh your recollection if I showed you what you said to the grand jury about that incident? Probably. And in other words, Mr. Snedden didn't like the answer when he said nothing happened. Mr. Jackson did nothing untoward or improper. Mr. Jackson ran up the stairs, saw them, and ran down. That wasn't enough for Mr. Snedden, so he wanted to give a transcript to his own witness to remind him of what he should say. Okay, so he does it. He does it. Right in front of you. Gavin, with regard to that portion of your testimony when you indicated to this jury just a little while ago that you had no recollection of what Mr. Jackson said when he walked in front of you naked. Do you recall that? Yes. Well, he didn't really walk. He just came up the stairs. He came up the stairs? Yes. And you saw that he was naked? Yes. And I asked you if you recall whether he said anything to you. Do you recall that, in front of this jury here? Yes. And you said you did not? Yes. And it goes on and on. It's the story of this case. Anything to win.
All right, we'll stop for the afternoon. See you tomorrow morning at 8:30.